The moment I stepped out of the rideshare with my suitcase still rolling behind me, I noticed something that made my heart drop and my eyebrow twitch. At the same time, there was a lavender robe hanging on the railing of my guest house porch. My lavender robe. The same one I had packed away in storage before flying to Dubai for work. And if that wasn't enough, a woman I'd never seen in my life was lounging in a deck chair, sipping from a wine glass. I recognized from my own kitchen set. She didn't jump or apologize when she saw me. She waved. Then she had the audacity to say, "Welcome to the neighborhood, stranger. I hope you're not here to disturb the guest house guest." That was the exact second I realized I'd stepped into a twisted HOA soap opera where I wasn't the homeowner anymore. I was the uninvited guest. It had started 3 weeks earlier when I left my suburban property in the supposedly peaceful neighborhood of Willow Creek Estates for a consulting trip in Dubai as a 32-year-old data systems architect. Traveling for work wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that I had left the guest house locked, the main house double secured, and my friend Jasper checking. In every few days, I even had motion-triggered cameras installed around the back and front entrances. Everything should have been normal, but nothing was. My return was supposed to be simple: land, unpack, order, pizza, sleep off, jet lag. Instead, I stood there in a jet-lagged haze, trying to make sense of why a complete stranger was camped out on my property with a bowl of Olive's Bluetooth speakers and a dog I'd never seen before chewing a slipper that might have been mine. The guest house door was wide open. My hand twitched on the handle of my suitcase as I approached the porch. The woman was maybe in her mid-50s with tightly curled blonde hair that screamed over-processed a name tag that read Karen and an expression that made it clear she was used to being obeyed. I cleared my throat and said, "Excuse me, I think there's been a mistake. This is my property." She looked at me like I'd claimed the moon. "Your property?" "Oh, no, honey. The HOA designated this guest house for temporary use while my condo is fumigated. Leonard signed the approval check. The registry." I blinked. I didn't even know a Leonard, and I definitely didn't remember authorizing the HOA to turn my guest house into a community Airbnb. The more she spoke, the more my chest tightened. Karen, as it turned out, was the self-appointed hospitality coordinator for the HOA. I'd heard rumors about her before, how she measured grass height with a ruler, fined people for unapproved Halloween decorations, and once called animal control on a neighbor's emotional support cat. But I had never personally crossed her until now, trying to keep my voice level. I asked, "Do you have a lease agreement or any documentation for this supposed temporary stay?" Karen scoffed and stood up, her dog barking at my ankles. "I don't need a lease, dear. I have community authority. The HOA board allows for emergency accommodations when needed, and I'm allergic to sulfur. My building's full of it. If you have a problem, I suggest you take it up with Leonard." I wasn't about to argue any further while sleep-deprived, but something was very, very off. I pulled out my phone and texted Jasper, "Did you notice anyone staying in the guest house last week?" His reply was almost instant. "Thought you had a renter or something. Figured you'd cleared it with the HOA. I didn't." And it wasn't just confusion anymore. It was trespassing. The only key to that guest house should have been on my ring, or so I thought. I waited for Karen to leave for what she claimed was a pedicure appointment. As soon as she drove off, I marched into the guest house, documenting every inch. She had moved in like it was hers, clothes in the dresser, food in the fridge, even a wall calendar with notes, scribbled like she planned to stay a month. I didn't touch anything, just recorded footage. Then I checked the locks, standard deadbolt. Easily replaced 30 minutes later, the entire house had a fresh lock system. I sat in my car in the driveway, sipping gas station coffee, and waited when she returned and tried the door. It was glorious. She jiggled the knob, rattled, it knocked, then pounded, then shrieked. She turned, saw me in my car, and marched toward me like a suburban general going to war. You locked me out. That's illegal. That's a violation of renters' rights. I'm calling the police. Go ahead, I said calmly. I've got time. She did right. They dialed 911 and told the operator I had broken into her temporary residence and changed the locks on her. She used words like unlawful entry, tenant harassment, and even squatter eviction. I sat back and waited. The officers showed up in under 10 minutes. Karen ran up to them like she was reporting a murder. She even pointed at me and said, "That's him." He broke into my rental and threw out my medication. The two officers, Daniels and Mendes, by their name tags, walked over to me, trying to assess the situation. I showed them my ID title deed, digital photos of the property listing, and video from the last 2 hours. Karen, meanwhile, kept ranting about Leonard and sulfur allergies. Officer Daniels finally turned to her and said, "Ma'am, do you have any legal documentation showing you're a tenant or were granted access by the property owner?" Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She stammered something about verbal agreement and community precedent. "That's not legal tenancy," Daniels said. Frowning at that point, Karen pulled the wildest card. Yet she said, "I've been here 2 weeks. That makes me a legal occupant under California code." "This isn't California, officer?" Mendes replied dryly, "This is Colorado, and that code doesn't apply here." Karen's face went pale, then red, then full nuclear. She accused me of being a scammer, said I must have forged the deed. Then out of nowhere she screamed, "Call Leonard, he'll back me up." Leonard did not back her up. The HOA president arrived 20 minutes later, wearing a bathrobe and slippers. He looked exhausted. Karen ran up to him expecting support, but Leonard barely even looked at her. "You told me this was a vacant property. You said." The homeowner, "Gave you permission. I never said that. I cut in and I have it all on camera." Leonard's face dropped. He turned to the officers and muttered something about Karen acting on her own. Then he added, "We'll need to review this with the board." She wasn't authorized. Karen looked like she'd been hit by a truck. She spun on Leonard, shouting about betrayal and official positions and her rights. Leonard just walked back to his car. By the end of the night, the officers gave her one final warning to vacate immediately or face trespassing charges. She refused, said she'd call her lawyer, said this wasn't over. She was right, it wasn't over, not even close, because what she didn't know was that the guest house had a second camera hidden in the wall clock, and what I caught next would blow the lid off everything. By the next morning, the situation had transformed from outrageous to outright insane. I barely got any sleep, checking the camera feeds from both the guest house and the main property throughout the night. Karen hadn't left after the police departed. She'd marched back to the side yard, climbed in through the unlocked laundry window like it was a college prank, and then turned off the porch light like she had paid the electric bill. I watched her sip tea from one of my mugs and prop her feet on the guest house coffee table like she was settling in for a weekend getaway. The fact that she'd been explicitly told to vacate by law enforcement didn't seem to faze her one bit. She wasn't just entitled, she was operating in a dimension where logic didn't apply. When the sun rose, I drove straight to the precinct to speak with Officer Daniels again. I showed him the new footage, Karen trespassing, again breaking in and mocking the police's warning as she muttered something about squatter rights and how she knows a judge. Daniels sighed, clearly not surprised, and said he'd escalate the report to their legal enforcement division, but even he admitted that civil property cases like this often take time to resolve unless she caused damage or posed an immediate danger. There wasn't much they could do on the spot without a formal eviction notice. It was as if Karen had found the legal grey area and parked herself there with her yoga, mat and herbal tea, not wanting to wait for a slow court process, while a woman who used my towels slept in my bed. I called a lawyer. My attorney, Ms. Connors, had handled enough HOA-related disasters to know exactly what we were dealing with. She was the kind of woman who could reduce a judge to silence with a single raised eyebrow after reviewing the situation. She instructed me to document everything, serve Karen with a cease and desist, and prepare a formal trespassing affidavit. But she warned me not to expect instant result. Karen's behavior was textbook delusional authority syndrome, a term I hadn't heard before but that now felt painfully accurate. Meanwhile, I made a copy of the hidden camera footage and started editing together clips that showed Karen entering the property lying to officers and raving about how Leonard gave her the place. I uploaded it to a USB drive and decided to pay a little visit to the HOA office myself. If Leonard had truly known nothing about Karen's intrusion, he needed to say it on the record, and fast. The HOA office was in the community centre, a stucco building next to the tennis courts. I arrived just before noon and walked in to find Leonard in his usual state, hunched over a coffee mug and avoiding eye contact with every resident who walked by. I introduced myself again and explained that things had escalated. Leonard looked like he aged 5 years since we last spoke. "She told me you were okay with it," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "Said she had permission. I didn't question it. You'd be surprised how often people in this neighborhood agree to temporary housing swaps or emergency stays. She said you were in Dubai, unreachable." I leaned in slightly. "And did she tell you how she got in?" "Because I never gave her a key." He blinked. "She said the HOA kept a spare on file for safety reasons." That was news to me. The HLA did not under any circumstances keep spare keys to privately owned goose houses. Leonard's face flushed slightly, and I could tell he was beginning to see how deep this hole really was. "Look, I'll call an emergency board meeting," he said quickly. "We'll review her conduct, but between you and me, she's been difficult last month. She cited someone for having wind chimes the month before. She tried to ticket a disabled vet for leaving his trash can out too early." I handed him the USB drive. This has footage of her entering without permission, lying to law enforcement, and settling in like she owns the place. If the board doesn't handle it, I will publicly. Leonard swallowed hard and nodded. I could see he wasn't thrilled, but he understood the threat. Back at home, I found Karen had finally left, temporarily. Her SUV was gone, and the guest house door was unlocked. I stepped inside with gloves and my phone camera. It was worse than I thought. She hadn't just moved in. She'd redecorated. My carefully arranged furnishings were now buried under throw pillows that looked like they came from a discount spa. A giant salt lamp buzzed near the nightstand. She'd burned incense, leaving black soot on the ceiling fan. My guest house now smelled like a hybrid between patchy oil and vinegar. I opened drawers to find her things, stashed neatly away: socks, toiletries, even a little notebook labeled HOA official, guest log. Flipping it open, I found entries. Written in her tight, loopy script: March 4th, settled in owner is abroad, a little dusty, but acceptable. March 7th, used owner's fridge, forgot almond milk. Left note March 10th, neighbor's child too loud. Left warning on their window. I stopped reading. This wasn't just someone squatting. This was someone cataloguing their fantasy life inside a stranger's home like it was a business trip. The level of confidence was surreal. To make matters worse, she had left behind a printed notice on the guesty: house table addressed to the HOA Maintenance Committee requesting approval to repaint the exterior in seafoam tranquility, and a handwritten map of what she planned to rename the side garden. She had even assigned names to the stepping stones. I couldn't make this up if I tried. Just as I was stepping out, I saw a figure approaching the house, a tall blonde woman in running shoes and sunglasses. My neighbor Celeste. She waved and looked cautiously toward the guest house. I thought you had a friend visiting. She said Karen told us you'd rented it out through the HOA. She had a clipboard and everything. I told her the truth. And Celeste's face pad that explained so much. She said she's been watching us. She told my daughter to turn her music down last week and said she'd report us for noise pollution as we spoke. Another neighbor, Adam, came up from across the street, then one more. Each of them had a story. Karen had inspected their gardens. Karen had left HOA citations on their mailboxes with made-up fine amount. Karen had even told one elderly couple to move their rocking chairs off their own porch because they didn't match community color guidelines. It was like opening the floodgates one by one. My neighbors confessed their Karen stories like a support group for HOA survivors. I realized something that changed everything. This wasn't about me, it was about everyone. Karen had steamrolled, manipulated, or intimidated into silence that night. I uploaded the security footage to a private site, sent the link to the HOA board, and emailed Miss Connors the full evidence packet. Karen had underestimated me. She thought she could invade my space, twist the rules, and walk away like nothing happened. But now I had the community on my side. What she didn't know yet was that I'd also found something buried behind one of the cabinets. She'd move a worn envelope with a spare key labeled in her handwriting, "Emergency Backup." That was the key she'd used to get in, and that meant one thing. The locksmith she hired knew exactly what they were doing. Someone helped her break into my property, and I was going to find out who, because the next time she walked back in, she wouldn't find incense and wine waiting. She'd find flashing lights, legal papers, and a neighborhood that had finally had enough. Karen didn't return that night, but her presence lingered like smoke after a grease fire. The guest house still smelled like eucalyptus and artificial vanilla, and I couldn't sleep knowing someone had lived in my home without permission. Pretending to be in charge, at sunrise, I brewed coffee and opened my laptop, determined to go deeper if this woman had done this to me. There was no way it was her first time. I started with public records, local forums, HOA reports, and even social media. Within hours, I had a thread of breadcrumbs that told a story far messier than I expected. Karen Thompson, age 56, previously lived in a different HOA-controlled neighborhood. 3 towns over, she had resigned from that HOA board after a series of disputes involving misuse of common space, unauthorized citations, and what was vaguely described as misleading legal claims toward fellow residents. It was all written in sanitized HOA jargon, but it didn't take a genius to read between the lines. Karen had pulled similar stunts before. What stood out most was that she had quietly relocated without public fallout. No lawsuits, no viral scandals. It seemed her playbook was based on confidence, false authority, and the assumption that most people wouldn't push back. I needed more than records. I needed real stories that meant knocking on doors over the next few hours. I visited more neighbors, people I'd nodded to in passing, maybe waved at during yard work, but never really talked to. The moment I mentioned Karen's name, reactions ranged from sighs to eye rolls to outright frustration. Mrs. Gutierrez, 3 houses down, recounted how Karen had borrowed her garden tools and returned them 2 weeks later, covered in paint. The Keene, a retired couple, said Karen had tried to issue them a back doll fine for leaving a bird feeder too close to a utility box, even though the feeder had been there for years. One of the teenagers on the block said she caught Karen peeking through their backyard gate, claiming she was checking for unauthorized pet breeds. What struck me most was the silence. Everyone had a story, but no one had challenged her. The common refrain was always the same: "It's not worth it." Karen's threats of legal action, her constant name-dropping of HOA regulations, her unrelenting stream of emails, she had intimidated everyone into apathy. That realization flipped a switch inside me. I wasn't just dealing with a trespasser, I was dealing with a self-appointed tyrant who turned neighborly courtesy into a weapon. That afternoon, I reviewed the footage from the hidden clock camera, again, frame by frame. At one point, just 2 days before my return, Karen had hosted what appeared to be a small gathering in the guest house. 2 other women arrived, both carrying trays of food. They sat on my couch, poured wine, and toasted to something I couldn't hear. Karen had even given a mini tour of the bathroom and kitchen like a proud Airbnb host. It was surreal, watching strangers clink glasses on my property, completely unaware they were being recorded. I took the clearest screenshots and sent them to Miss Connors. She replied within the hour, advising me to prepare for a cease and desist delivery. To all individuals present in the footage, we weren't just going after Karen. Now we were establishing a pattern of misuse that turned civil trespassing into something more layered, and with the neighbors now talking, the momentum was shifting. Then came the next twist. I received an anonymous envelope in my mailbox, no return address, no name, just a stack of printed emails between Karen and someone named Greg Hall. The emails outlined Karen's request for a non-registered locksmith job, complete with photos of my guest house door. She'd sent him my address, labeled it authorized entry, and even promised board-level clearance. My skin crawled as I read the conversation. Greg responded affirmatively, mentioning he didn't need paperwork as long as the payment was in cash. The final email confirmed a date, 4 days after I left for Dubai. This wasn't just about trespassing. Karen had coordinated an illegal break-in with a locksmith who either didn't care about the law or was in on her game. I drove straight to Miss Connor's office and handed over the document. Her eyes scanned the pages and her expression hardened. "We'll subpoena Greg," she said. "If this is real, he's complicit." Now we had leverage, and I wasn't going to let it go to waste. I requested an emergency HOA town meeting through Leonard. He hesitated, but once I told him I had undeniable evidence of criminal behavior, and that if the board didn't respond, I'd be taking it to the media, he scheduled it for that Friday evening on the day of the meeting. The community center was packed. I counted at least 50 residents, some clutching lawn chairs, others standing by the walls. Karen arrived 10 minutes late, dressed in a tailored suit like she was attending a courtroom drama. She smiled at people she'd terrorized for months, shaking hands as if she hadn't fined them for flower pot placement or noise violations. Leonard opened the meeting with the usual pleasantries, then cleared his throat and gestured to me. I walked up to the front with a small projector and my flash drive. The room dimmed. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The footage spoke for itself. Karen sneaking into my home. Karen hosting Y night. Karen lying to officers. Karen unlocking the door with a non-registered key. Gasps filled the room. Someone near the back muttered, "She told me she was babysitting a friend's cat." A woman stood up and said she threatened to sue me for letting my daughter draw chalk on the sidewalk. I followed the footage with a brief statement. Karen acted without authority. She lied to the HO she trespassed. She broke in with help, and she weaponized your silence. When it ended, Leonard returned to the front and announced that the HOA board would vote immediately to suspend Karen's position. Pending further investigation, he promised cooperation with law enforcement and the attorney's office. Karen stood up and tried to speak, but this time no one handed her a microphone. The room had shifted, her grip on the neighborhood had cracked as the crowd dispersed. People approached me with thank yous, handshakes, even invitations to dinner. I wasn't just the guy who owned the guest house anymore. I was the one who'd done what no one else had dared. Stand up and say enough, but Karen wasn't finished. Later that night, I received an alert from the driveway camera. Karen was standing at the gate, arms crossed, talking into her phone. A moment later, she looked directly at the camera and mouthed something I couldn't hear. I zoomed in and read her lip. "This isn't over, you'll regret it." But this time, I didn't flinch. I'd pulled the curtain back and the whole community had seen what she really was. She could threaten all she wanted now. I had the footage, the facts, the neighbors, and the law on my side, and Karen, all she had left was a crumbling fantasy and a growing list of charges. The next 72 hours unfolded like a perfectly scripted drama, but the kind where the villain doesn't realize the audience has already turned on them after the HOA town meeting. Words spread fast. Karen's name became a verb around the neighborhood. "Don't care in my yard," someone joked on the community Facebook page, but beneath the humor was a tide shift. People were finally talking, sharing stories, swapping photos of the bizarre notices she had left on their mailboxes over the past year. One woman even found a laminated warning that claimed her roses were too emotionally aggressive in hue. Another neighbor revealed that Karen once tried to tow a retired Army veteran's trailer because it disrupted the visual harmony of the street. The woman had made herself queen of the cul-de-sac, and we had all played along out of fatigue until now I wasn't done. I knew Karen was still lurking, and I wasn't about to leave any opening for her to creep back in. I hired a professional security crew to reinforce the guest house entry points, upgraded every single lock, and installed a smart access control system that required facial recognition. A bit much, maybe, but after watching a stranger hold court in my own home, I had no interest in being reasonable. I also set up a backup generator, multiple cloud-connected cameras, and motion-triggered alarms that would activate a blinding strobe if someone approached. Without my phone's proximity signal, the final edition was more theatrical, a live speaker system that allowed me to project my voice remotely into the guest house. I programmed it with a greeting that triggered if movement was detected after midnight. "Welcome to private property. Law enforcement has been notified." It wasn't just for security, it was for psychological warfare. Karen didn't play fair, so I was done playing nice. The first night after installation, I didn't sleep. I watched the feeds, half expecting her to test the system, but she didn't come back, not that night, not the next. It almost felt disappointing. But on the third night, around 2:13 a.m., the front camera sent a notification. Karen Hood up, face tense, pacing at the end of the driveway. She didn't approach the guest house. She just stood there glaring at it like it had betrayed her. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call, pacing. In tight circles, I zoomed in and recorded everything. Her lips moved rapidly, hands slicing the air in exaggerated gestures. From what I could gather, she was ranting to someone about how they turned everyone against me, and this is my neighborhood. Then, in an absurd twist, she hurled her phone onto the grass and stormed off into the dark. Not 10 minutes later, 2 HOA board members, Leonard and a woman named Susan, texted me separately. Both had received a mass email from Karen accusing me of hacking HOA records, weaponizing community sentiment, and committing architectural harassment. That last phrase sent me into a laughing fit. I wasn't sure if it was the fatigue or the absurdity, but architectural harassment sounded like something from a satirical novel about petty suburban dictatorship. Susan told me the board wasn't taking Karen's accusations seriously, but that the volume of emails she'd sent since the meeting was disturbing. Over 70 in one day, each more unhinged than the last one. Even claimed that I was hiding a surveillance drone in my hedge and that I was mentally destabilizing the neighborhood with covert Wi-Fi attacks. At this point, I began compiling everything into a dossier my lawyer, Ms. Connors, loved. She said we were building a solid case not just for trespassing, but for harassment, defamation, and malicious interference with property. The next day, I got a call from a local journalist. Apparently someone had tipped her off about the HOA showdown. And the footage I had presented, she wanted to do a community spotlight piece on suburban abuse of power. I hesitated at first, but then I remembered Karen's face in that meeting, how she streeted in like she owned the block and tried to turn fiction into fact. If she could spin narratives, so could I agreed, and the reporter came by for an interview the following afternoon. I gave her everything, the footage, the emails, the timeline of events, and introduced her to 3 other neighbors who had their own stories to share. Within 24 hours, the article was published on the station's website. The headline was brutal. HOA, horror. Local resident turns guest house into personal palace. Faces. Legal blowback. Karen's face, pixelated for privacy, sat beneath a still from my security footage showing her sipping wine barefoot on my porch. It wasn't just a hit piece, it was a wake-up call. The comment section exploded. People from all over the state chimed in, some sharing eerily similar experiences, others offering advice on legal options. The story got picked up by a larger media outlet within the week. That's when things hit critical mass. Karen tried to do her own damage control. She scheduled a public interview with a local blogger who styled himself as a community truth teller, but the move backfired during the recorded segment. She was visibly defensive, contradictory, and emotional. When asked why she thought she had the right to occupy someone else's home, she snapped, because no one else was using it. That clip alone went viral. It was reposted, remixed, memed, and mocked into oblivion. The neighborhood teens created a TikTok trend called Karen's Guesthouse Rules, featuring people doing mock tours of their own living rooms while pretending to be self-declared HOA royalty. I watched it all unfold with a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. This woman, who had once walked these streets with a clipboard and a condescending smirk, now couldn't step outside without getting side-eyed by passing joggers. But instead of accepting defeat, she doubled down. She filed a counter-complaint against me with the HOA, accusing me of community defamation, claiming I had damaged her reputation and mental health. The board dismissed it within 12 hours. That same week, Ms. Connors filed official charges for trespassing, unauthorized entry, property damage, and attempted fraud. The fraudulent locksmith operation was under investigation, and the man Greg Hall had been issued a subpoena. Apparently, he had ghosted Karen once. Media attention hit. She was alone now. Every bridge she built had burned down. Every alliance crumbled. As a final act of petty desperation, Karen printed out dozens of flyers claiming I was manipulating the neighborhood with tech surveillance and intimidation tactics. She taped them to utility poles, trash bins, and community mailboxes. But she forgot one thing. I had cameras pointed at all of them within the hour. I emailed those videos to Leonard and Susan. The board had seen enough. They called a special session and voted unanimously to permanently remove Karen from any HOA involvement. She was banned from participating in meetings, committees, or any decision-making role. Leonard delivered the letter himself with a witness present. She slammed the door in his face. It wasn't just a victory, it was an exorcism that night I hosted. A backyard barbecue, dozens of neighbors came, some I barely knew, brought drinks and snacks, others showed up with stories, and everyone was finally smiling. The atmosphere was light, even defiant. It was the first time in months the neighborhood didn't feel like it was holding its breath. Someone made a toast to sanity returning. I raised my glass, glancing toward the darkened corner of the property where the guest house sat. The lights were off the door, sealed, and the alarm-armed Karen was out. For good, but I knew one final act remained, and when it came, it would be loud, messy, and unforgettable, because Karen wasn't the kind to exit stage. Left quietly, she was the type to grab the curtain and set it on fire on the way out, and I was ready. I woke to the sound of sirens again, only this time it wasn't an emergency, it was theatre. Karen's final act began just after 6 a.m. when she showed up at my property with 2 moving trucks, 3 men in neon vests and a clipboard that looked suspiciously homemade. I watched from my upstairs bedroom window, sipping coffee, as the men hesitated at the driveway Karen was directing them like a movie set. PA pointing at my guest house and yelling that they had 20 minutes to begin removing her belongings before the eviction becomes legally contestable. She wore a pantsuit, like she was about to argue a Supreme Court case, and for dramatic flair, she'd added an American flag pin and dark sunglasses, despite the overcast sky. I didn't intervene. I simply turned on the external security speakers and let the automated voice do its job, warning, this is private property law. Enforcement has been notified. The workers looked at each other, alarmed. One of them asked Karen if she was sure about this. She responded with the usual tirade about civil statutes and squatters' protections under property utility laws, which wasn't a real thing, but sounded technical enough to make them pause as they stood debating what to do. I walked outside, phone in hand, Livest streaming the whole encounter to our neighborhood group morning. I said, looking to steal a building today, or just the porch furniture. Karen turned her mouth, already forming a threat, when a police cruiser pulled around the corner and came to a stop. Officer Daniels stepped out, looking less like an officer and more like an exhausted teacher sent to deal with a particularly unruly student. For the 5th time in a week, he asked what was going on. Karen immediately launched into a monologue about personal possessions, HLA failure, legal confusion, and an ongoing property arbitration that apparently existed. Only in her imagination I played the footage for Daniel's Karen instructing workers to enter without permission, her scribbled notes, and even the flyer she'd plastered all over town. Just days ago, Daniel sighed and radioed for backup. That was when Karen snapped. She shoved the clipboard at him and began shouting about corruption, favoritism, and how the real criminals were inside the system. Her voice rose high enough to make a crow on a nearby tree fly away. The workers stepped back, visibly uncomfortable, and one of them actually said, "Lady, we're not getting paid enough for this." Now then Karen made her final mistake. She kicked over one of my solar garden lights, not a big deal maybe, but it tipped over into a ceramic planter which shattered and rolled down the step. Daniels calmly walked over and read her right. Karen screamed, "Not words, just noise." She shrieked about lawsuits, said she was being kidnapped, and claimed to be a protected HOA dignitary. The other officers who had now arrived handled it with professional calm. She was arrested for trespassing, destruction of property attempted, theft, and obstruction of justice. The workers quietly packed up and drove away. I waved to them. Karen, now handcuffed in the back of the cruiser, screamed that this wasn't over, but it was later that day I walked down to the HLA building, where Leonard and the rest of the board were in a formal session. The mood was somber, not because Karen had been arrested, but because the community had reached a breaking point. She wasn't the only one. The system that had enabled her, the vague policies, the unchecked power, the lack of transparency was on trial now, and everyone knew it. Leonard gave me the floor. I didn't use my projector this time, I just spoke. I talked about what it means to live in a community, about the difference between rules and righteousness, about power misused under the mask of policy. I reminded them that for months everyone had seen what Karen was doing, but felt powerless to stop it, not because they lacked courage, but because the system had no fail-safe. And then I ended with a simple proposal: restructure the HOA charter to prevent unchecked authority, term limits, documentation requirements, oversight by residents, not just elected volunteers. They voted unanimously to approve it over the next 2 weeks. Things moved quickly. Karen's arrest made the local news again, this time with full audio of her claiming to be a diplomatic guest of the HOA. The judge at her preliminary hearing didn't even let her finish her statement before setting a date for formal trial she tried to represent. Herself, of course, that went poorly. At one point she declared, "Your Honor, I am not the accused. I am the victim of neighborhood tyranny." The courtroom laughed. The judge didn't. She was released on bail, but under strict orders to stay at least 500 FT from my property, and to avoid all HO-related meetings. She violated that within 5 days by sending a proxy to a board session with a thumb drive labeled Karen's Defense Part 1, The Hidden Truth. Leonard handed it directly to the HOA's attorney without even plugging it in. Meanwhile, the neighborhood began to feel different. People started taking walks again, chatting across yards, even hosting potluck. I noticed more porch lights left on, more smiles, and passing fewer closed blinds. The change wasn't just about Karen, it was about fear losing its grip. Then came the cherry on top. Ms. Connors called with an update on the locksmith investigation. Greg Hall had agreed to a plea deal and had turned over a full paper trail of his dealings with Karen: emails, call logs, even a recording of a phone conversation where she instructed him to ignore the owner's name and just do the job. The DA's office was now considering adding conspiracy to commit unlawful entry to the list of charges. Connors sounded pleased. "She's going to wish she just left a note on your door," she said. "Karen tried to file a civil suit against me, claiming emotional distress and loss of reputation. It was dismissed immediately. In fact, the judge fined her for wasting the court's time when that ruling came down. I printed it and framed it inside the Guesthouse foyer with the headline, 'Karen versus Common Sense Case Closed.' I eventually decided to renovate the Guesthouse completely, not just out of necessity, but as a statement. I replaced everything. She touched new walls, new appliances, even a new security system embedded in the flooring. Then I listed it online, but not for rent. I made it available free of charge for local teachers during summer break. I called it the respite word. Spread quickly, and soon I had a waiting list giving it purpose. Felt like the final act of closure one evening. As I was tending the yard, Leonard stopped by. He handed me a sealed envelope. "We're officially naming you a CHOI advisor for community security and integrity," he said. I laughed and told him I didn't need a title. He smiled. "Then consider it a warning label for the next Karen." I watched him leave, then glanced at the guest house. The porch light flicked on as the motion sensor picked up a rabbit hopping by. I smiled, thinking back to that moment when I'd come home from Dubai and found a stranger drinking wine on my porch. What started as a bizarre intrusion had become a story of reclamation, resistance, and renewal. And though Karen had tried to script herself as the hero, she'd written her downfall in bold, chaotic stroke. And I had simply let the cameras roll, because in a neighborhood ruled by clipboard tyrants and power-drunk busybodies, Sometimes all it takes is one person to say no, no to fear, no to silence, no to fabricated authority, and yes to locking the gate, changing the narrative and letting the whole world watch what happens when you stand your